Steve Hanke is back. He is a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University. We'll be talking about monetary policy, the outlook for interest rates, with the outlook for the Chinese economy and what that's going to do for not just China, but the rest of the world. And we'll talk about perhaps some political pressures on big tech companies and just generally speaking, what's coming up for the elections. Welcome back to the show, Professor. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you, David.
A lot of topics, a lot of diverse topics that we'll go over today. Let's start with recent news coming out of Jackson Hole. As you know, Jerome Powell at his speech earlier at the Jackson Hole meeting had discussed that, or reaffirmed rather, that a Fed cut in September is likely. Now, do you think that this is going to put downward pressure on the U.S. dollar once we begin a series of Fed cuts?
Well, to some extent, that's already in the market. The dollar's gotten a little bit weaker in the last several weeks against the euro, for example, and the most important price in the world is the dollar euro rate. Those are the two most important currencies. So the answer is yes, but not really a big deal.
Okay.
A lot of it's in the market, and the market really hasn't moved very much, and the dollar remains very strong.
Yes, it's been trading range bound. The DXY has been, range bound the last couple of years, but in the last couple of weeks, it's been trending down. I presume on the back of strengthening pressures from the Bank of Japan, for example, on the yen and perhaps other forces. Do you see this trend continuing of downward pressure on the
Well,
dollar?
a little bit, but
Yeah.
again, I don't anticipate really a big
Okay.
deal because everyone is anticipating that the Fed is going to cut the federal funds rate, and it looks like this September meeting. Now, if you look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, it's about 50-50. About half the people participating in that market think there's going to be a 25 basis point cut in the federal funds rate, and the other half thinks it'll be 50 basis points. So that's kind of baked in the cake. That's been in the market even before the Jackson Hole speech of Powell, and it really came into the market big time when they had the huge revision in the employment in the United States. It turns out, there about 800,000 jobs were just not there. I mean, they revised the job count way down, 27% reduction in that job count.
Yeah. What's
So
your reaction to that? We hadn't had a chance to speak the day that news came out. When you saw that revision, biggest downward revision since 2009, did you change your outlook on the jobs market on that revision at all?
no, it's exactly what I thought was going to happen.
Okay.
The money supply has been contracting in the United States. It's the stock of money in the United States measured by M2 is lower now than it was in July of 2022. And as I've indicated, David, before, those contractions have only occurred since 1913 when the Fed was set up only four times. And each one of those four occasions for money contraction was followed by a recession. Or in one of the four cases was actually 1929 to 1933. We had a Great Depression. We didn't have a recession. We had a Great Depression. So John Greenwood and I have consistently said with these monetary contractions and monetarism and the quantity theory of money, and as a monetarist, our conclusion is that things are going to slow down. We're going to be in recession territory late this year, early next year. So the jobs reduction didn't surprise me at all. It just confirmed what I've been basically saying.
Before we continue with the interview, I want to tell you about another way you can invest your Bitcoins and store them safely instead of using a traditional wallet or an exchange. Consider an IRA. Today's sponsor, iTrust Capital, is one such IRA that offers 35 crypto assets and the lowest trading fees in the crypto IRA space at 1% only. And being an IRA, it also offers unique tax benefits. If you'd like to get started and learn more, click on itrust.capital/David in the link down below or scan the QR code up here. If you're over 18 and you want to open a new account with cash or roll over an existing account, you can do so using my referral link. And if you use that referral link, you'll get $100 in signing bonuses. I like to talk about, well, basically what you're saying is whoever gets into the White House at some point next year will inherit a recession. And then they'll
Yes.
probably blame the other party for having started it.
Oh yeah, there'll be all kinds of, the spin doctors will be in full gear, doing their thing. And by the way, coming back to Powell and Jackson Hole, his speech was interesting in the sense that he claims, and he's getting by with this in the press, by the way, that inflation was caused by distortions that were associated with the pandemic. That's what he said. Now, what that means is, remember the old supply chain glitches that supposedly caused inflation? No, it's all about the money supply. He didn't say anything about changes in the money supply, which he's responsible for. And what happened? In February, we had February of 2020, pandemic hit. February of 2021, the money supply, M2, was growing at an annual rate of 27%. That's a record. And no wonder that was followed by inflation. If the money supply gets goosed like that, you always have inflation following it with a lag. And that's exactly what we happened. He was full of propaganda, absolute baloney of the highest order, putting his finger on the cause of inflation as being distortions that were associated with the pandemic. So no wonder the Fed never predicted what was going to happen with inflation. John Greenwood and I predicted what was happening with inflation. We said it would go up to as high as 9%. It went up to 9.1%. So, the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
And now, just to recap for the audience who hasn't seen our prior episodes, by the way, I recommend you check out Professor Hanke's and I's episodes from prior interviews, links down below. But anyway, what did you say was going to be your target for inflation going into next year?
The end of this year, Greenwood and I have it at 2.5 to 3%. That's the CPI headline number. And right now it's at 2.9%. So it's very, very clearly we're going to hit the ball out of the park again by paying attention to what? The economy's fuel, money. And we're running on fumes now. The money supply has been contracting. And now, even on a year-over-year basis, it's only growing, a little over 1%.
Speaking of inflation, let's talk about Kamala Harris's plan to fight inflation. We talked a lot about Trump's policies or plans. Links down below if you want to check out Professor Hanke takes on Trump and J.D. Vance's policies. This is what Kamala Harris plans to do. She wants to build 3 million homes and grant new buyers, first-time home buyers, a $25,000, I guess, incentive and assistance. So basically, new homes on the order of 3 million and $25,000 given to new home time buyers. I don't know if that's going to be in the form of some sort of loan or just cash. I'm not sure, but that is what she talked about. And here's a quote from her campaign state director. Vice President Harris knows we need to do more to address our housing crisis, and that's why she has a plan to end the housing shortage and will crack down on corporate landlords and Wall Street banks hiking up rents and housing costs. Oh, that's the other thing. They're going to do something about rents. I presume some sort of rent control. But for now, 3 million homes, $25,000 in assistance to first home time buyers. What's your reaction to this?
Well, first of all, we don't know the form. statements are kind of fuzzy, if I can use that term. So we don't know exactly the form that the 25 grand is going to come in, but let's just call it, it's going to be a gift. Where's the money for the gift going to come from? It's going to come from people like that pay taxes in the United States. It's a little like, I would call it theft, because who buying a home has the right to receive $25,000 credit, check, cash, whatever form it comes in, from somebody, a taxpayer who hasn't even agreed to the thing? That usually, if someone walks up to David Lynn and they say, I have the right to have $25,000, and oh, by the way, could you open your wallet and give me 25 grand?
Well,
That's usually called theft.
I have a theory, Professor. I believe it may come from the higher corporate tax rate that she plans to impose on corporations. Remember, going up to 28%. I believe it's 21 or 22% currently. So that may be a source of funding. I don't know.
We don't know where the money is going to come from specifically, but it will come from taxpayers. I can guarantee you that. Whether it's corporate or individual, we don't really know.
Well, let's talk. I want to just ask you about the idea, the principle of giving money to first-time home buyers by the order of $25,000. Would that, in theory, just be inflationary by the order of $25,000? I mean, presumably, if we have more first-time home buyers entering the market because now they're able to put a down payment, wouldn't people just raise the price of existing homes?
Well, it would change. Let's not call it inflationary. It would change the relative prices of things.
Oh, yes, yes.
And given, assuming everything else is constant, as they used to always like to use a Latin phrase, ceteris paribus, in economics. Ceteris paribus, what happens? You give somebody extra cash to buy more real estate, and the demand for real estate goes up, and prices are going up, not down. So then she comes in with the other hand and says, well, I'm going to control this. I'm going to have laws that control the price increases somehow. I was reminded, somebody just dug out. One of my former colleagues was doing a historical check in the Baltimore Sun and came across the first op-ed I ever wrote in the Baltimore Sun was an article in which I laid out the stupidity of rent controls. That's the first article I ever wrote.
Do you remember when you wrote it and what you wrote?
I actually, I don't have it in front of me right now, but it was in the early 1980s, and
right.
And the conclusion was rent controls are bad. They mess up the housing market and distort things enormously, and from an economic point of view, they're a bad deal. Well, wherever we've had rent controls, you have all kinds of nefarious activities associated with trying to get around the rent controls, and ironically, you usually end up with a housing shortage.
So this is where the other part of her plan comes in. Some economic advisor was probably giving her ideas. So on the one hand, yes, rent control may have the downside potential of creating a shortage, which is where the second part of her plan comes in. 3 million homes being built over the course of her presidency, I presume. That would, in theory, counteract that. So we've got incentives for first-time home buyers. We've got a countermeasure to a housing shortage from rent control.
Yeah, well,
maybe this might work. I don't know.
This is one of these things in economics of waving a magic wand and coming up with a story and scenario. This is baloney of the highest order. This is very misguided, by the way, and even the liberal press the New York Times, for example, and Washington Post. They're democratically controlled, shall we say, or heavily influenced. Both of those papers slammed this as being nonsense, which it's just blatant nonsense. Even the press that's supporting her had to come down pretty heavy against this as kind of a harebrained idea.
But which part of it is a bad idea? The 3 million
Oh,
homes or the
well, but both parts,
okay.
the whole thing. Part A and Part B were rejected.
Okay. Well, well, all right. I see. She gets this plaque gets an F on Hanke's
Yeah,
on Hanke's
right.
tests.
I didn't quite. They weren't that tough on her, but it was pretty bad.
Professor, do you think though that we need to build more homes? By we, I mean I don't know. Home builders need to build
Oh
more
yeah,
homes.
there's absolutely no question about it. We have a backlog of inventory and housing in the United States. This is the one reason, by the way, for years I've been bullish on home builders, stocks and equities and home builders, because of this backlog of of housing that has to be built theoretically. Now the problem is that you have a tremendous amount of resistance or sand in the gears, because you have all kinds of local regulations and zoning or mandates and so forth that slow and constrain the supply. They squeeze the supply. Think of it as a supply and demand curve. They're shifting the supply curve to the left all the time, but that's local. Most of it is not federal. Most of these things are local. For example, in Maryland, if one of our border states, as you know, is Delaware. So if you go on the eastern shore of Maryland and you're driving across Maryland, you don't see very many new homes being built, because the cost of all the regulations and government mandates are very high in Maryland. You cross the border into Delaware, where the regulations are a lot lighter, and you find all kinds of new houses being built.
Very good. Let's follow up on more of the Harris and Trump campaigns policies closer to the election. Let's talk about China now. You had sent me some very interesting show notes about China that I like to touch on. Before we talk about that, though, I'd like to ask you about what's going on between China and Canada. As a Canadian, I'm very interested in this topic. Prime Minister, rather, Prime Minister Trudeau recently, as you know, imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and a further 25% tariff on Chinese steel and aluminum imports. It's been reported today that experts expect some sort of retaliation from the Chinese. So, my question from a Canadian, as a Canadian, what kind of retaliation can we expect, Professor?
First of all, let me make a remark about
Yes.
Prime Minister Trudeau imposing these things. Now, this is a classic Trudeau move of shooting himself in the foot, if not the head. He's a big greenie. He wants to go to a green transition. He's made all kinds of promises, and as part of that, of course, EVs, electric cars, and then the place where you can that's producing a lot of high quality, inexpensive electric cars is what? China. And now he's basically going to double the price of those Chinese cars that are supposed to be in the interest of going green. So the policy is completely contradictory, but that's with Trudeau, that's nothing new, and with many politicians, by the way, it's nothing new. So that's one thing. The retaliation, we can see it. What they're doing right now. We have the big headline in today's Financial Times. And today we're speaking of what? August 28th, we're talking with each other. Chinese export curbs on key minerals threaten Western chip makers' output. Germanium and gallium prices doubled overnight because they've put a squeeze on these things. Early last week, they put restrictions on antimony. So the Chinese have an ace up their sleeve, and the ace up their sleeve are minerals, rare earths in particular, but lots of critical materials. Most people don't realize that the Chinese dominate in the fields of mining, metallurgy, and material science. If you look at the university rankings, for example, in mining, metallurgy, and material science, they rank very highly and are dominant in China. The Chinese come in at the top of the heap if you look at those areas in the educational system. The other departments, the other areas in China don't even show up in the top 500. In those three M's, what I call the three M's, mining, metallurgy, and material science, they dominate the top 10, not the top 500, the top 10. So in 1992, the Chinese actually, in a bulletin, said that they were going to use rare earths and critical materials to counterattack the West, suppressing China. So that's the answer to your question with some precision.
Okay. Do you think that Trudeau is perhaps just mimicking U.S. policies on the tariff side?
That's what it looks like.
But overall, then, you don't support these policies from either a Canadian or U.S. perspective?
Oh no, I don't. There's no question about it. This is all protectionism, and protectionism will either lead to a horrible end or a horror without end. One of the two. Take your pick.
Yes.
Would you like a horrible end or a horror without end?
Just pick my. What is this game? The pick my poison game?
Yeah, right.
I'd rather refrain from playing, Professor.
Yeah,
I'd rather have a pleasant conversation with you and
yeah.
not go there. Professor, what about the overall growth of China? We've been getting reports this year that the Chinese economy has slowed down, that perhaps it's at some point they saw deflation, at some point youth unemployment skyrocketed. What is going on there? How will that affect the rest of the world?
Well, again, you've got to look again at the money supply and apply the quantity theory of money and monetarism, because that's the fuel that makes the economy go. Changes in the money supply will, with a lag, affect nominal GDP, and nominal GDP has two components: inflation plus real growth. So what's been going on in China, if you look at the Hanke's golden growth rate for the money supply, M2 in China, should be around 11% to allow them to hit their inflation target in China of 3% per year. That's their inflation target's 3%. If they want to hit that, they should be growing the money supply at about 11%. Right now, it's growing at 6.25%, and it's decelerating fairly fast, actually. If you look at the 6-month annualized growth rate, it's about 3.9%. And if you look at the 3-month, this is down to 3%. So it's year over year, it's about half of what it should be. And if you look at a shorter duration at kind of the margin, it's slowing down pretty fast. And one reason for that, of course, is the banks aren't extending much credit in China. And that's part of that is the fallout from this property crisis that China has been in. If you look at China and look at it, put it into context, what's going on behind this monetary thing that I just said. From 2010 to 2020, only 10 years, China built 9.6 billion square meters of housing space. That's 9,600 million square meters. The total office space in London is 25 million square meters. So the 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 growth in those 10 years, 2010 to 2020, of square meters of residential housing is 385 times more than the total square footage of office space in London. So what was going on? Well, what was going on? There was some speculation going on, but the whole idea was moving people out of rural areas and agriculture into urban areas. And to do that, you need houses, you need apartments, you need space. So that is not going to continue. And this has big implications, because if you're not building houses and apartments at that rate, of course, a huge commodity demand for commodities that occurred in that 2010 2020 period, that's not going to happen. And that's what's going on. I mean, the banks aren't loaning money into real estate anymore. So as a result, the money supply comes down. So that's the nub of the problem. It is the housing dynamic, but the bottom line always comes back to what's going on with the money supply. And the money supply is slowing way down, is way below the level that would be consistent with hitting a 3% inflation. So this again comes back into a larger thing that we talk about, and the propaganda that's in the press. The propaganda that's in the press is that inflation is a global phenomenon. No, it's local. It depends on what the local central bank's doing. And as you can see, if the local central bank's slowing the money supply down, and it's growing at a rate that's much lower than the inflation target, you will have an inflation rate that's way lower than the inflation target. So the inflation target's 3% in China, and the inflation rate's about 0.5%.
Is there any possibility, and I'm just speculating here, suppose the Chinese central bank were to increase the money supply dramatically, would that A, help their economy, and B, also translate to the U.S.? Would that perhaps stave the U.S. off a recession if another major economy engages in QE?
Yeah, absolutely. If they would get that thing growing up at about a steady rate of 11%, it would be healthy for the Chinese economy. Point number one, and obviously it would help the rest of the world, because of two factors. One, China is a huge economy. I mean, if you calculate it on a purchasing power parity basis, it's actually bigger than the United States. If you use nominal exchange rates to make the calculation, the U.S. is bigger than China. But any way you cut it, it's a huge economy and very important. So that would be a plus. The other thing it would do is it would tend to stimulate or encourage more Chinese private consumption and reduce the level of Chinese savings. And as a result of that, the trade surplus that everybody's wringing their hands about in China would go down. Because the surpluses and deficits in trade, people don't understand. Why does the U.S. always have a trade deficit? They've always had it since 1975. They have it because we have a deficiency in savings. Savings is a lot less than investment in the United States. And to fill in that gap caused by the deficiency of savings in the United States, we must run a trade deficit, which we do. Now, China is the opposite. China has a huge savings surplus. Savings is much greater than investment. So by definition, just working out these identities in national income accounting, they must run a trade surplus, which they do. It's just like Switzerland. Switzerland saves way more than invests, and Switzerland has a trade surplus. Japan, typically, Japan is in the same boat. Typically, Germany is in the same boat. So that there are two factors that would happen. One, it would be a positive for growth in China, and in that sense, positive for the rest of the world because China's a big economy. It would also be positive from kind of a political point of view. It would take the tension out of this trade surplus thing that's going on in China now. The recent theme is that and narrative is that they have too much production capacity in China, and as a result, they have to flood the world with exports. That's their strategy. No, it's just a matter of the arithmetic. They save much more than they invest, and as a result, their trade surplus must be large. That would correct a little bit if the economy got going at a little higher speed in China and the consumption picked up. And if consumption picked up, the savings rate would go down a little bit. And if the savings rate went down a little bit, the trade surplus would go down a little bit.
Let's move on to another topic. This came in from the press just this morning. Pretty big on social media. Mark Zuckerberg says the White House pressured Facebook over some pandemic content. Now, he posted a letter on social media, on the Facebook page and their accounts on X. He says, I believe the government pressure was wrong, and I regret that we were not more outspoken about it. He says the officials expressed a lot of frustration with the campaign when the company didn't agree. And the letter said that if this were to happen again, I also think we made some choices that, with the benefit of hindsight and new information, we wouldn't make today. We're ready to push back if something like this happens again. I like to ask you about, first of all, this trend of government oversight on independent publishers and tech companies, and what this means for free speech going forward.
What's interesting about this letter is that Zuckerberg did fess up that the White House was strong arming Zuckerberg and Facebook. So that's point number one. Now, Zuckerberg, of course, he tries to slip out from under the news by saying that basically it didn't really affect us. And then the third thing he says, well, maybe it did affect us a little bit. You just said with hindsight, maybe he would do something a little bit different. So his response was kind of threefold. One, the White House tried to strong arm him. That's one. Two, well, it didn't really affect us. We didn't really do anything. But then he comes back later and he says, well, there's some things that maybe we would have done differently if we had the opportunity to do something again. Now, that suggests that the strong arming did affect them. Because if it didn't affect them, why would they have second thoughts looking back on it? Why would they have been thinking about doing something different? So to me, it's interesting in the sense that we all know the White House and governments try to strong arm the press. This is nothing new. This has been going on since the beginning of the press. But with the social media and so forth, it takes a little bit different form, and it's become much more aggressive. And particularly in light of COVID, the censorship arm has gotten more muscle in these governments. They all have tried to shut down anything that went against the narrative of the government. For example, the governments all around the world, except someplace like Sweden, were locking people down. They had all kinds of policies that were locking people down, shutting things down. And they didn't want any evidence presented that contradicted that as being a wise policy. Now, as it turns out, the meta study, the the definitive study on this is a book I wrote with Jonas Herby and Lars Jonig that was published in London by the Institute for Economic Affairs called Did Lockdowns Work? You can go online. You can put that up on your link to our interview. The book's free. It's highly technical. To put it into context, in the United States, we found that, and by the way, this meta study, we looked at about 20,000 articles. So we were reviewing what the scientific literature was saying about lockdowns. And if you look at the United States, lockdowns saved a little over 4,300 lives. And in a normal flu season, 38,000 people in the United States die of flu. So that gives you an idea of what's going on. In Europe, we found that lockdowns saved about 6,000 lives. And the normal flu season in Europe, about 72,000 people die of flu. So the effects of the lockdowns were small. That was a message that the politicians did not want to go public. And I experienced that. And I wrote about it in an article with Jay Bhattacharya that was published in Economic Journal Watch. We talked about and Jay, by the way, is a professor of medicine at Stanford, and we talked about the censorship that was going on in this COVID area. So Zuckerberg's letter to me was important because it confirmed, by the way, what I experienced myself. And by the way, Zuckerberg's fact checkers were all over this study that I did with Herbie and Lars Jonig, claiming this, that, and the other that weren't true. And of course, the fact checkers, happened to be Facebook fact checkers. So that's how the system has worked. A lot of censorship, and I think it's still with us. I don't think Zuckerberg's letter is going to make it go away anytime soon, but at least Zuckerberg finally fessed up to something we all knew all along, and that is that the White House was strong-arming the social media outfits like Facebook.
Where do you stand on what private companies should do in this situation? This is a difficult position for him to be in, because on the one hand, nobody likes to be strong-armed. By the way, I remember reading this during the pandemic where Mark Zuckerberg said that before this incident, before the pandemic, he was pro minimum moderation, and then he happened to have intense levels of moderation during the pandemic, and then he sided with what his company was doing, which was moderating content. He believed that it was for the good of the people to have some moderation. Okay, there's some truth to that, I suppose. And then now he's saying that he regrets caving to government pressure. Well, what should he have done? I mean, where is the line? On the one hand, there's scientific literature, which you just talked about. On the one hand, there's just blatant misinformation that's wrong. I'm not saying what your study was doing was wrong. Okay. I'm saying other people's stuff. So what do we do with that stuff?
Okay, I'm a free speech, First Amendment type of person. So
all right.
So I'm against the government interfering. Now, the government always is trying to spin the news. And this has been going on a long ago. This happened. It's been with us since day one. The government's always trying to spin the news and put the government in a favorable light. I think in this particular case, it would have been great if Zuckerberg would have written that letter when the White House started putting pressure on him. That's the best way to protect free speech, is to basically have the social media blow the whistle on the government and say, look, these guys are trying to strong arm us and trying to tell us how to run our operation. And we happen to be for the First Amendment and free speech. So things that are consistent with the free speech and the First Amendment, I'm all for.
Well, now the government is going as far as to arrest people, heads of large social media companies. I'm not saying this would have happened to Zuckerberg, but let me just throw at you another piece of news that happened over the past week. French authority, French authorities arrest Telegram CEO Pavel Durov at a Paris airport um, just a few days ago. Emmanuel Macron said this decision was not political. He said that, well, the authorities have said that this decision was made because Telegram has failed in moderating all sorts of illicit activities, including trafficking of people, laundering of money, so on and so forth. And investigators from the National Anti-Fraud Office in France, attached to the French Customs Department, notified Durov, 39, that he was being placed in police custody. So there was something to do with fraud being used or being perpetrated using that platform. Now, as you know, Telegram is one of the most widely used social media platforms in the world. It's especially popular in Russia. Is it true that this decision was purely because of laws being broken in the countries in which it operated, or was it political? Macron claimed it wasn't.
Okay, let's drill down on this a little bit. For as you know, Mrs. Hanke happens to be a Parisian, and I happen to be a Francophile, so we follow we follow what goes on in the Republic, and we follow Macron, of course. Now, it turns out that Macron, let's put this thing into context. Some time ago, years ago, Macron actually had lunch with the Russian, who is the founder of Telegram.
Pavel Durov, yes.
Yeah, Pavel. And why did he have lunch with him? He was trying to talk him into moving Telegram to Paris, and he said, "If you do, I'll give you French citizenship." That was a lunch several years ago. Now, the famous satirical newspaper, The Weekly in Paris, is just come out this week, indicating that satirical newspaper is a Canard Enchaîné, and the Canard indicated that Macron. Why did Pavel go to Paris? Why did he fly from Azerbaijan in his plane to Paris to have dinner with somebody? According to the Canard, it was because Macron invited him to dinner in Paris. Now, if that's true, and usually, by the way, the Canard has good sources and is reliable. It's a little bit like Cy Hirsch in the United States, the reporter, the investigative reporter. Remember the My Lai massacre and various other things that Hirsch it was the guy to uncover. Well, the Canard is usually pretty reliable, and like Hirsch. And if that's true, what they printed, that means it was political, because Macron is the president of the Republic, and supposedly he invites this Pavel to dinner, and basically invited him into a trap.
Okay, so you
So
think
that's where we are. I'm just repeating what's in the press.
this has nothing to do with retaliating against Putin?
Well, we don't know exactly the motivation, but the key point is to look at the president of the Republic, Macron, and ask what's his involvement in Telegram been. And day one is that he was trying to get him to relocate in Paris, and it's reported in the press that if that would have occurred, he would have granted Pavel citizenship. Now, Pavel does have citizenship anyway now, but that was lunch one, and dinner one was this alleged invitation by the president of the Republic for him to have dinner with him, and that's why he came to Paris, and that facilitated his arrest. Now that's the according to the Kana.
Well, okay, I'll close off on this. Do you think that governments, doesn't matter which French government, US government, doesn't matter, should have the authority to arrest the founders of a social media platform if crimes were committed using that platform? For example, if I message you, Professor Hanke, about some sort of shady, illicit deal that you and I were to make using Telegram, should Telegram be made responsible? This is a statement from Telegram. It is absurd to claim that a platform or its owner are responsible for abuse of that platform. Almost a billion users globally use Telegram as means of communication and as a source of vital information. We're awaiting a prompt response or resolution of this situation. Telegram is with you all. So back to my question.
Well,
Should they be
let's
made
keep the yeah
responsible?
let's keep the thing simple here. Let let us say that David Lynn is an operator of a gasoline station, and some guy comes in and has a 5 gallon can, and he wants it filled with gas, and you sell him the gas, and it turns out that the guy's an arsonist and lights a fire in a theater, and people are killed and so forth. Is David Lynn responsible for the fire and the deaths?
Well, no, but what if the arsonist told me ahead of time? He said, "I'm going to buy your gas and I'm going to, light a fire somewhere." That's basically what's happening here because Telegram could read their messages. That's what the authorities are claiming.
I think we're getting into
Yeah.
legal thick weeds
Yeah.
here.
Fair
So
enough.
I don't think Lynn and Hanke are going to settle this legal issue on on the David Lynch
But
show.
I understand your point about the arsonist. Yes, I mean it's not.
So
You shouldn't be
so
punished with it.
we don't. By the way, it's not clear what they're actually charging
Yeah.
Pavel with. We don't even know yet.
Right.
They so so it's a little bit hard to say what actually is going on.
All right. Well, good session today. We can contact Professor Hanke through X. We'll put Hanke's X profile in the link down below. Click on that, and also we can email Professor Hanke using his email, also in the description down below. Please submit to us questions you would like us to answer for the next session in a few weeks. Anywhere else we can follow you, Professor? I think that's it.
Well, I I think that's fine. The Twitter
Yeah.
at Steve_Hanke is really the easiest way. Or David, people that watch the show sometimes send emails and want to be on my distribution list. They just send me an email at hanke@jhu.edu.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for coming back. And
Yeah,
for
great
educating
to
us
be
as
with you.
always. Yes, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.